Wednesday. This is going to be an interactive session, so I'll ask some questions. Feel free to raise your hand and come to the stage or ask a question. I can repeat it. We can go over kind of what the answer would be. And yeah, I hope we find some good value for you guys in this topic. I'm not sure. Here's the first polling question. How many of you are actually looking at Edge, either as an equipment provider or as a customer? OK, so maybe 40 to 50% of you. How many have more than 10 data centers in their environment? OK, good. So it's still a learning curve for you guys. Myself, just to do a quick introduction, my name is Eric LaJoy. I'm a solution architect as a pre-sales role within Red Hat. I'm focused mainly on one customer. It's an equipment provider out of Finland. We'll just leave it at that. I help my customer consume Red Hat as Lego blocks in their solutions, kind of in that fashion. I've got about 15 years in experience in telco, and I just turned 40 in April. That's kind of a prelude to something else you'll figure out on Wednesday if you come. So I am getting quite old. Yeah, so I guess I'm almost to the Zet release of myself. What we'll cover today is we'll go over what we have for a model for Edge. So we're all here for open infrastructure, which used to be all OpenStack. We all did the OpenStack journey, or maybe a majority of you have. We're all starting to do the Kubernetes journey and a combination of the two, or maybe even kata containers. We'll look at 3 models today. One will be, how do you do Edge with Linux? Not a really good story, but we'll look at it. We'll look at the story, how do you do Edge with OpenStack? And then once we've done that, we're going to look at how do you do an Edge story with Kubernetes and VMs, which comes back to the title of this session. At the very end, I'll share a couple hardware kind of examples that I've seen. I'm interested to hear from you guys if you're a hardware vendor or if you're using hardware in your Edge story. Share your story. You could even come up and we could maybe find a way to have you get a mic and share what you're doing as well. So the Edge scenario, if we look at what we have coming in use cases, we have Ericsson in the corner over here doing 5G. Impressive. I mean, how many of you have a 5G phone? I think there shouldn't be a single hand in the room, right? 5G is pretty new. And those guys have an antenna up. They've got the whole packet core. They've got the whole radio side of it. And they're letting you guys get access over Wi-Fi off their backhaul link from, what was it, a Netgear device. That's an excellent example of a use case for 5G. They might want to put some of their stuff out in a light pole. Like, for example, Nokia. They have a session right after this that they'll be talking about how they're using ARM at the edge. And on the ARM, they're doing some pretty cool stuff there where they're giving you 5G out of a light pole. I think it's part of the Crano talk they're having. Again, a good session to go listen to. If you see here, you have on the far right is going to be a classical data center. What you have there is your typical, if you're talking a telco use case, which happens to be what I do most of the time, you're going to have pretty much your packet core back there. And then you're going to have other satellite data centers that have basically the backhaul from the cell towers. And the way things are changing, when we had 4G, I'm not sure how many are familiar with 4G, but one of the requirements was, when it first came out, you had to have a round trip time of your traffic, your user traffic, under 50 milliseconds. And with 5G, it's supposed to be 1 millisecond. And if you're a networking person, you can imagine that that's pretty tough to get 1 millisecond of round trip time for a packet to a core data center. Hence the use case for Edge. You can see I've listed a few use cases here. We have the vRAN, which is the one I'm mainly talking about, which is what Timo and I will be discussing on Wednesday. We have the connected car. This one's going to be interesting because this is a moving edge. Imagine your car has a CPU in it or a computer that's strong enough to actually run containers. And what if some of your enhanced features, like if you go to Elon Musk and he's got you a Tesla car, right? Maybe some of his advanced features are running as containers inside that car. I don't know. But we do know that the computers in cars are coming with more powerful systems. So that use case would be a mobile data center, which would also be considered an edge data center in my own opinion. Use case 2. Use case 3 is, let's say you're a large service provider, AT&T, Verizon, Deutsche Telekom, for example. They're going to build edge, and they may build extra capacity in the edge. Let's say you're watching Netflix, and you actually want to have 4K. You want to have, it's part of your data plan, you're not going to pay for it. One use could be that they actually sell some of the infrastructure at the edge to a third party, like maybe Netflix or someone else. And that's kind of their return on revenue. So that could be another use case. The other thing I see is that, and this is again going back to the vRAN use case. If you deploy vRAN and you're in a city, let's say your first deployment, you've got 20 towers across the city, and you've got this edge use case, which you're seeing now. I think, so if we're looking here in this stack, right? So in the now, you may have 10 edge data centers across the city. And let's say 5G gets more dense, and they figure out that they want to turn the power of the radio sites down, but increase their capacity so that all the users overall get more throughput or get better performance. If they need to do that, they now need to basically blow out the data centers that they've put out there, the 10 of them, maybe to 100. And that's kind of where this future comes into play. So we have basically in the future, you might have 10x, 100x fold of these data centers that are doing the same thing, but you're putting them closer and closer to the expanding radio cell sites. Maybe the same with cars. If you think about it, all these connected cars are going to be connected over 4G and 5G. So they're going to be, it's almost like having two use cases overlaid on each other. Now, if you think about it, maybe Ford and Chevrolet, or I don't know if they exist anymore, but for example, Ford, they may buy a footprint in this edge data center from the provider who's built the data center. So just get you guys thinking about how I'm seeing edge, and I think I'd like to hear from you guys how you're seeing it as well. But that's kind of like what this slide is showing you here, is that you have edge, far edge, and you may actually just start the journey at edge and then make the external or the forward-looking journey to far edge, depending on how your use case evolves. Here's some pros and cons quickly. I'm just checking our time. We've hit our 10-minute mark, but I think this is the only lightning talk I've seen on the schedule today, so I think we can go over. For Linux, if you think about it, you could just deploy Linux as your edge node. Perfect. You run KVM, you put runc on there, you got your containers and your VMs. Now, how do you manage the VMs? How do you manage the containers? Are you using Virt Manager, or are you using your own Ansible scripts? Why not use something like OpenStack's APIs and its whole infrastructure is put in place, or something that like Kubernetes with its APIs doing the same thing? There's a key difference, though, between OpenStack and your Kubernetes container environment, which we'll get into at the end here. But the cons really for the Linux, and when I first thought about Edge, I'm like, yeah, you know, Linux is a perfect fit for Edge. But then you start thinking about, okay, day two, how do I upgrade? How do I do lifecycle? How do I support it? What if there's an outage, right? So these things were all coming into mind. The toughest one was the lifecycle and managing the scale. If you've got 100,000 Linux machines out there, how are you going to manage them? Why not take advantage of something that's built by the community like OpenStack or Kubernetes? Now with OpenStack at the edge, what you have there is there's new things coming, and I think a lot of the OpenStack vendors have a similar solution. In my company, it's actually called distributed compute node. What it means is that if you looked at Ironic, remember all the Ironic stuff we were hearing this morning? Most of that stuff, if you look at it, it's using Pixie Boot to boot up a bare metal machine and then use some other software to provision the hard disk inside of it and then reboot into whatever OS that you've built, in summary, right? When you're in an edge store, you don't have this layer 2 connectivity between the edge site and your data center where you're going to build the nodes from. So you either build your nodes ahead of time and ship them, or you find something like distributed compute node where you're doing a combination of things where you can actually provision these nodes over an L3 network. The other thing, too, is that with OpenStack, you can run a Kubernetes environment on top of it. This is kind of like a baby step to get into a container native. This would be something like a Kubernetes distribution of your choice running on top of OpenStack as a VM, and you basically are running two infrastructures layered on each other. There was some talk during the keynote as well that this is not ideal because you lose performance when you start abstracting the layers. There's some benefits there. You could look at certain vendors that use Courier, which lets you, instead of using two OVS bridges in that type of a solution, you wrap it down to one OVS bridge. Fair enough, that's pretty good. I have a colleague, Frank Bowden, who's presenting, I believe, tomorrow. He's got an idea that's not really solidified into a product yet, but I think it's a great idea. It's using SRV and OpenStack, and I don't want to give this whole thing away. It's pretty cool, but think about it. If you could provide virtual functions to your Kubernetes environment on top of OpenStack, you're giving them line rate network access, which is this whole problem with layering in the first place. The thing that I would say is the con to the OpenStack would be that you're layering your products. So Kata container is a different story. So we know Kata container and Kubernetes on OpenStack are different things. So those are things to consider as well. Where I really think edge is going, from my view, and this is personal, and I think it's also within the company I work for, from what I've seen in our product strategy, but containers native at the edge is where I see things going. What I see is this new concept called Cloud API. If you think about it, you can have those 3 layers that we had at the edge. You had your core, you had your edge, and your far edge. With Cloud API, and we also heard someone in the keynote today talk about Metal Cube, right? When we're talking about Ironic. Metal Cube is, in my way to summarize, it's a way for Kubernetes to call an API and provision bare metal nodes via Kubernetes APIs. And now if you take those data points, think about them for a sec. If you use this thing called Cloud API, which is part of Kubernetes, you got your core data center running a Kubernetes distribution. You can use this Kubernetes distribution to provision a bare metal Kubernetes distribution at your edge. So now you've got Kubernetes managing Kubernetes. And now if you need to grow your far edge and you classify your far edge as a different category, let's say you're now running ARM at the far edge instead of x86, you then can do Kubernetes managing a 3rd layer of Kubernetes from that layer. So you could almost get 3 layers of Kubernetes. Or you could choose to do a model where you provision everything from a local Kubernetes managing all the edge via Kubernetes. So it's evolving. This isn't something that I've seen anyone productize yet or even build in the community. But keep this in mind. I think this is going to be a big play in the edge strategy across all of the different Kubernetes cluster vendors. The other thing in my view is if you do go to a native container environment, you're still going to have some outliers using VMs. The way to do that in Kubernetes would be with something called KubeVirt. So you can see it here listed in one of the cons that you can run KubeVirt, which basically takes KVM and the VM and wraps it in a container wrapper, I would call it. And then you have the ability to run a VM in your Kubernetes environment. If you want to talk about it later, there's this whole concept of Multis and all your CNIs and how all that works in the background. But this is was supposed to be a 10-minute talk in Lightning, and we're now 16 minutes in. So you can see we can go quite far in this topic, which Timo and I will do on Wednesday as well. I would say right now the con for probably the containers is the CNI. So remember when OpenStack started, we had issues getting DPDK, SROV. There's a bunch of different high-performant features that took a while to get developed in the community. Have the same thing going on in Kubernetes right now. So we have user space CNI coming, which will be used inside Multis. OVS is becoming DPDK enabled. There's SROV. There's also some other concepts where the NICs will offload. So Mellanox, Intel, and all the other NICs vendors, they're making the ability to offload OVS into the NIC. So a lot of that stuff's going to be probably, in my view, coming into Kubernetes, but I haven't seen firsthand it being developed by anyone. So with that, here's a quick view of the hardware I've seen. The interesting thing here is that, for example, this Nokia one, that one and probably multiple other vendors are putting FPGAs in. So that's the other thing I'm starting to see at the edge. And if you're going to use a low-performance CPU, but you still have something that needs a lot of performance, but it's very specialized, you may see the edge devices having FPGA-based cards that do a specific task in those nodes so that they are, you're getting exactly what you need to do the job. Now, they're not multiple workload type scenarios, so you wouldn't use an FPGA type box to also support CDN. But for example, that might be something there. And please come up to me after the session if you see other hardware options at the edge. I'm trying to gather and see what's out there. It's quite interesting. And with that, here's the session that's coming up on Wednesday. This is kind of some self-advertisement. Timo and I will be covering this. It's going to be mainly Timo covering 5G edge use case. I think it's going to be quite interesting. And we'll also go through a specific use case there as well. With that, thank you very much for your time.